At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Welcome, everyone, to American Girls, the podcast where we're reliving the American Girls series book by book, except here on Patreon, where we're reading and watching and listening to things that we think live in the world of this show. I'm going to say I'm Catherine Harris.
Oh, I'm still Allison.
You know, I might hang around for the rest of this episode, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do.
Fun fact, Catherine Harris was one of the few accused witches not hung in Connecticut.
Oh, quite lucky. I mean, maybe.
I'm coming into this episode so hot. This was one of my requests months ago. We both wanted to get into this book, but this is a book that's very special to me because I grew up in Wethersfield, Connecticut. I was, as a result, dying and waiting for someone to accuse me of being a witch from the time I was a child because I read this book and I really, really loved it. And I still do. This is probably about the fifth or sixth time I've read this book.
This is my second reading of The Witch of Blackbird Pond, and I was shocked to learn that it came out in 1958. That was very surprising to me.
When did you think this came out?
I had always assumed, I think because of the copy that I had as a young person, which had a very much like 80s, early 90s stylized cover. I had the one where she looked like a witchcraft Barbie. I thought it was like an 80s or 90s book. I had no frame of reference for how old this book was.
Yeah, I think I kind of assumed that too. And then it was kind of the benefit of growing up where I did that it's kind of a weird situation. Like, growing up in Wethersfield, it's obsessed with its own history in a way that certainly the rest of the state even is not. Like, there's an ongoing debate about what is the oldest town in Connecticut. Technically speaking, it's likely Windsor. However, if you're from Wethersfield, you're just obligated to say it's Wethersfield. We're close. There was a man in our town who used to dress up as a red onion every year to attend our corn fest. Yes, I grew up in a place that has a corn fest. And he would literally just like engage people in arguments that no one was really fighting him on this, but he was like, it is my life's mission to convince people that Wethersfield is the oldest state in Connecticut.
Why?
Great question. I always wanted to be like, what's this about for you, sir? Like, why this hill? Like, why are you willing to die on this hill? But it is kind of interesting that, you know, in a lot of the curriculum, local history has dropped out of like things that people teach or have time to teach because of all different requirements and whatnot. But this was part of school when I was growing up. But there was definitely way more of an emphasis on the American Revolution and Wethersfield's ties to that, which are kind of minimal at best. But basically, Silas Deane, who may or may not have been a spy, lived in Wethersfield. And he hosted, or his home was the site of a meeting between Washington and Rochambeau to plan Yorktown. So if you walked through Old Wethersfield, you would think that that was the most important thing that ever happened there. Wrong. To me, the most important thing that's ever happened there is, one, Wethersfield, among other towns, is the site of a witchcraft panic that predates Salem by decades. But also, it's the imagined site of this book, and I really love this book.
Yeah, I was doing some research on the author, Elizabeth George Speare, and she went to Smith College, where her favorite professor was actually Nellie O'Malley Parkington, which I didn't know before.
Weird.
Really weird.
Wow, small world.
She went there in the 1930s, which I think, this is a topic for another day, was one of the more interesting times ever to be in college for a whole bunch of reasons. But she went to Smith College and then went to Boston University, and her first book was about a captivity narrative, and that got her really interested in 17th and 18th century history. And I was really surprised. I thought, you know, like, she's such an award winner. She only ever wrote 5 or 6 books, but pretty much all of them are classics, and I think that's aspirational.
Only
yes,
hits. That's all she gives us.
Exactly.
You know, oh my gosh. Yeah, sorry, you're going to get into more facts about Elizabeth
No,
Speare.
actually, this is a fact about me, and I don't mean to go here every episode where we do 17th century history, but I looked up the inspiration for the captivity narrative. That was her first book, and that is actually a person that I am distantly related to, which was a surprise to us all. When you have an ancestor who had 16 children at some point, you're related to a lot of people, so it's not exactly anything to brag about.
It's a real flex.
No, but I really enjoyed this book. I don't know that there's a ton of really specific points of minutia that you need to know to follow it, but I can read a quick summary for people who've never read it.
Feel free.
So the protagonist of this book is a 16-year-old named Kit Tyler. And so the summary begins, Kit Tyler is marked by suspicion and disapproval from the moment she arrives on the unfamiliar shores of colonial Connecticut, 1687. Alone and desperate, she's been forced to leave her beloved home on the island of Barbados and join a family she's never met. Torn between her quest for belonging and her desire to be true to herself, Kit struggles to survive in a hostile place. Just when it seems she must give up, she finds a kindred spirit. But her friendship with Hannah Tupper, believed to be a witch, proves more taboo than she could have imagined, and ultimately Kit forces Kit to choose between her heart and her duty. I would say this book is like not really about that in a good way.
Yeah, I don't think she's at all concerned. I think what's interesting about her as a character is that she's always kind of following an internal compass that doesn't almost make sense for the time and certainly not for the Puritan community that she finds herself in. So I think like framing this as like, oh, she has to choose between love and her duty. It's like she's not really wondering like what her duty is to anyone except maybe herself, which is interesting.
So we open with, I think, one of the better lines in a book that we've read maybe ever for this show, where she is going from Barbados to the colony of Connecticut, and then she has this like one last leg of the trip where she has to go up the river to where Wethersfield is now. And I kind of love this so much because she's been on a boat for a ship, I should say, for a long time. And she's asked what she thinks with this sight of the Connecticut River. She hesitates. She didn't want to admit how disappointing she found this first glimpse of America. I was like, I am going to love this book because I didn't remember a lot of it. I was like, I know I'm going to love this book. Like, who is not disappointed at this point? No, I mean, I think
that's very
she
true.
kind of hits on something. Kit is interesting because she comes from this family of tremendous wealth and not uncommon at the time, has no idea that her grandfather who's raising her has all of these debts. And so she ends up coming to Connecticut and having to live with an aunt she's never met. And the only thing she really knows is that this aunt is supposed to be hot. And then she arrives and, like colonial life has kind of dragged her down.
Because basically Kit rolls in with like trunks upon trunks of elaborate clothing, and then basically it's like Carrie Bradshaw rolls into Handmaid's Tale and she's like, Aunt Rachel, like, where did it all go wrong, basically? And we quickly meet a cast of characters who round out Aunt Rachel's family, and they're a real crew.
Rachel, there's a gaggle. There's not many, but there's a gaggle. So Rachel is married to Matthew, and they have daughters, Mercy and Judith. And there's only a few other people you really need to know about. There's William Ashby, who's wealthy but boring. And there's John Holbrook, who is poor but smart. And the Reverend Bulkley, who John Holbrook is coming to study with, who he kind of worships for no reason. And we all kind of see through him by the end of the book.
Yeah, like basically he's enmeshed in like a larger colonial political debate about who has the right to like govern the colony of Connecticut and the other colonies. And the uncle believes that it should not be the crown, but it should not be future Governor Andros who comes and seizes power. And Dr. Bulkley like is in with the royals. So basically like anyone who thinks the royals have any kind of power is not going to be welcome in Kit's new house, because like that's not the vibe.
I'm curious what you thought about this. Because I didn't grow up learning Connecticut history, Rhode Island has always been on its own trajectory, to present day.
Understatement.
Yeah, to present day. What I found really sort of interesting was this is set in the 1680s, but there seems to be a lot that is sort of predetermined in this story. Like there's a lot of talk about freedom, about men being able to like set their own destinies. And I was doing a little bit of research, but I know that you'd know more. It feels more like conversations, as far as I know, that people were having like 80 years after this. Like it's the 1680s, but they already seem very keen to be making their own decisions, to be sort of bucking the empire. And it felt early to me, but I also know that this particular spot in Connecticut was a hotbed of resistance to kind of too much crown rule.
I think that's definitely the case. And I think that the religious piece is really important here too, because the right to self-determination of their religious faith, I think, bleeds over into their understanding of politics and who can tax them and so on. I found the language about taxation to be like really on the nose about like people who are thinking more in like a revolutionary context than in this context. I think in ways that I appreciate about the book, she really emphasizes the day-to-day life of folks in this time. And I feel like, to me, that's the piece that needed to be foregrounded. I don't really know that the uncle would be having all the men of the town over to the company room to debate whether or not they would accept Governor Andros as their political leader and what they would do to fight that. But at the same time, they actually cover a very Connecticut-specific event, which is the hiding of the charter in a tree.
What kind of tree? I know, but Charter Oak.
Oh right,
Federal
yeah,
Credit Union.
Oh my God,
that's not SponCon, but if you've ever driven through Connecticut, Charter Oak Federal Credit Union is this like intrusive presence in my brain that I will never scrub out after commuting to an institution in Connecticut for 6 years.
That's entirely fair. What's actually interesting is that we never really learned Connecticut history. I didn't in school. We only learned it through field trips to historic, like local historic sites. So you would weirdly go to like the Witch of Blackbird Pond house, which is a house that's from this period that Elizabeth Speare imagined or had in mind when she was writing this book. But we never learned about the Charter Oak. We never actually learned about the witch hunts, like the actual women and men accused. So it's really weird. But the thing in the book that does feel political is like they do cover when Andros shows up and the charter's laying on the table before him. He has the windows opened because he's like insisted on lighting fires, and then the lights go out. And then when the lights come back on, the charter's gone. And he's kind of like not too worried about it based on the depiction here. But allegedly the charter was hidden in a charter oak tree. And, that tree became a site itself of sort of lore in the state until it, fell down in a storm, I think in the 1850s. But regardless, it kind of feels like Elizabeth was new to the state. She didn't grow up in Connecticut. And basically, like, she took herself or her children on tours of local sites and was like, okay, got it. Like, Charter Oak Tree is a thing. Gonna write that into the book. Like, Weathershield's known for onion production. Got it. That's going into the book. All of like these sort of snapshots where I think she's both like checking things off a list that are Connecticut specific. Like, okay, I know Connecticut's going to play a role in the revolution. I'm going to hit a bunch of those notes. But at the same time, like, I think her imagination really comes through in situating us in the everyday life of a Puritan family.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of that I would have never picked up on as a younger person, the younger sister, Mercy, who lives, so she's a cousin to Kit, I think is one of the most interesting characters because she's obviously very bright and she's very good at like certain household tasks, but she doesn't do things necessarily with incredible speed. But there's all these people who underestimate her and don't say, very flattering things about her. And Kit quickly realizes that she's kind of the emotional center of the family. And they refer to her as lame, as a person who has kind of, not enough speed. Basically, we might think of her as a person with a disability, but they don't use that language. What I thought was really interesting about this book is you see how sort of emotionally mature, how compelling of a character she is, and also how she does things slightly differently, but she's perfectly integrated into the family, right? Like there are things that Judith also can't do because Judith can't read a room to save her life.
Oof. Judith.
So it's kind of interesting. Like Kit is presented with this idea of Mercy, that she has, what they might have called like a debility, but she realizes actually she's hugely important to this family. And she ends up getting married, I think in part because she makes an emotional and intellectual connection with a man who's visiting. But I thought that was like, I don't know that you would even have that sophisticated of an interpretation of disability in that period for decades. Like, I think she just did a beautiful job.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think she's using a really helpful plot device, which is having an outsider come in. And because that outsider has not grown up in this household, they get this sense of perspective that only an outsider can have. Like someone who's seeing it at a remove can come in and say like, whoa, Mercy's clearly the emotional center of this house. Like she has the most maturity of anyone here. And in a similar way, it's like they're kind of looking at her. They're looking back at her and are like, you also have weird deficits that you're not aware of. Like this is a very like different worlds coming together. And in a meta way, it's like different worlds coming together for us because we're in 2020 reading a historical imagination from 1958. So there's choices and language and things in this book that would not appear in a historical fiction book today, we would imagine. So there's a lot of just like reading across lines happening.
I agree. I think there's language choices that would be different, but I also think part of why nothing about this as a younger person flagged this as a 40 to 50-year-old book is it's just great literature, right? Like it happens to feature young people. It's amazing literature. And I was looking at what are the top books from 1958, and it's this and Things Fall Apart and, you know, books by Kerouac and, you know, books that remain really, really important today. And I kept thinking, I wonder if there's something, and I'm not trying to overstate it, but I wonder if there's something inherently sexist in the fact that I know I was taught that The Crucible is a commentary by Arthur Miller, not really on Salem, but on HUAC and the repression of, you know, quote, un-American activity. I feel like this book is right up there with like the way that it critiques people who are conformists. And obviously it's written in 58. And I think like we put so much value on The Crucible and it's been done and redone. And it's like, you know, where are all the feature films and where is all the attention on this book? And I think because it's quote, children's literature by a woman, it's not, you know.
Well, and also that it centers a story of a girl, because you can even like look at some of the pop culture productions of this time on TV, things that were being adapted. And it's things like Davy Crockett, okay? So it's like we're willing to tell stories, like historical stories that get reinterpreted and told, aimed at an audience of children. We're not getting this book, which is fresh off the presses. I'm sorry, this book is amazing. Like, I don't care what anyone says. Like, this book touched me, like, when I was a young person. And it made me think that being interested... So one of the things, we've kind of glossed over the plot. Like, she comes...
The witchcraft plot.
The witchcraft plot. She comes from Barbados. She's big time fish out of water energy. There is an iconic, and I mean truly iconic scene in which she rolls into this house with her many trunks of clothing. Her uncle is like, what, like WTF? Like, what are we supposed to do with you? And then she's like, okay, he's like, you're coming to meeting with us. Like, that's happening. And so already I'm like, wow, brave. She goes to meeting in a bright red dress. Imagine this girl walking into a Puritan meeting. Everyone's wearing like whatever, not bright red. And everyone turns and is like, who the hell is this? And she's like, yeah, I'm here. Deal with it. And then is shocked to learn that there's then a second service later that day that she must also attend. But it's like, so she's big time fish out of water. But one of the first things she does is create a school for little kids that she teaches. And then people were like, that's too radical, because she has them like doing play acting of biblical stories. And then later in the plot, she teaches a young girl to read and to write her own name. So what becomes like transgressive is really her, you know, not her entrepreneurial spirit, so to speak, but really her embrace of education and her desire to like evangelicize not a different form of Christianity, but the fact that young children and also mainly a young girl should have the ability to read and write.
She's also someone who is suffering from sort of like class confusion, and, you know, she wouldn't have used that language, but she comes from a very wealthy background, but has essentially lost that status by leaving the Barbados and having lost the bulk of her grandfather's wealth, which very explicitly in this book, it's made clear that that wealth is bound up in people that he owned. And there is a passing line where she references the fact that she was able to pay for passage to Wethersfield by selling a person that she owned.
Yep.
And the way that that is portrayed in the book, that is a part of her life that she totally takes for granted. And when she comes to Wethersfield, she's asked to work incredibly hard, right on par with Mercy, Judith, her aunt, everyone else. And she's sort of shocked because to her, that kind of work does not make sense to her as a free person. And when she's picking onions, which frankly were probably also sold as part of the transatlantic trade, that is known as Wethersfield's kind of main, claim during that period, she explicitly says, like, this is work for slaves, is her language. This is not work for a free person like her who has a red dress, to wear to meeting.
Yeah, and I found rereading this, sitting with this storytelling really kind of tough. But also, ultimately, I think your first instinct is to think this is inappropriate of Elizabeth Speare to include this kind of blindness on the part of Kit. But as I've been thinking about this all week, I really think that, to me, this is way more realistic of, like, this is actually what Kit's worldview would have been. She would have seen her ability to sell a person that she laid ownership to as a way to fund her own passage as something that was within her rights and normalized in her world. I think the piece that is hard for me now, like reading this, is that there's an erasure or silence around the existence of slavery in the North. So yes. If you read this book, you kind of walk away thinking slavery is a thing that exists in Barbados and has no relationship to Wethersfield, even though she comes up to Wethersfield from Saybrook on a ship that is definitely taking part in the triangle trade. Shout out to the Dolphin and Nat, like her romantic interest, whatever. But, and we've had friends who work on this. I think that's actually the erasure that's more of a problem in this book, is that she's not talking about Wethersfield, Connecticut's, the Puritans' complicity in the slave trade. And that erasure, I think, is very of 1958.
I think that's very now.
Right.
Also,
yeah.
If you look at the way people are talking about the 1619 project, I think it requires so much unlearning among many people, but I won't say all people, to understand that connection. I wanted to be better educated on the onion piece specifically because I knew it was something I heard, but I wanted more details. I mean, onions really put Wethersfield on the map more so than a missing charter in their own time. But
Fair.
Part of it is it was an important element in the diet of enslaved people in places like the Barbados. So she's absolutely right to say, this is not labor that was expected of me before. And I was reading a teacher's guide on a Yale website, a very recent website, and it starts by sort of explaining that most people don't think of or don't connect slavery with the North, or that it's a surprise. And I think we have to kind of stop using that language. Like, I think we have to stop with the hidden, confusing, secret, dark, all of these words, like kind of resigning it when it's a core essential fact. Like, it's not confusing.
100%.
It's not hidden. I also guarantee that it's not something that she, being the author, had access to, right? Like, it may have been something she legitimately didn't understand or didn't know about. I think now it's like us as historians, it's like we all have to do better when it's like when we have the opportunity, not saying like, oh, this is like a really like unknown thing. No, it's like something that's been chosen this way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think growing up in Wethersfield, walking around Old Wethersfield, which is a very scenic spot, so scenic that in the past few years they've started filming some Hallmark movies there and such. Yeah, humble brag. I have nothing to do with that. But it used to strike me growing up that if you walk down Main Street towards the Cove, which is described in this book on the map, like how that it didn't exist in the lifetime of this book, you would see bronze plaques in people's front yards where it was like, this is land where George Washington's horses were stabled during his visit. Like, they're so obsessed in the 50s when these plaques were put in with George Washington's presence in Wethersfield. And this is not a Wethersfield specific thing. Like, people are obsessed with George Washington's presence in their town. That they were literally like, this is where he kept his horses. And every time I walk by this plaque, which is still there, I keep thinking, we know that there were free Black people living in Wethersfield. We know that there were enslaved people living in Wethersfield. And some of the museums, are, to their credit, are taking this on and doing really interesting interpretation around this. But that's very, very recent. And it's like, what was going on that contributed to problematically what we're calling Elizabeth Speare's blindness is like this kind of, presentation publicly of the presence and absence of Black people.
Can I ask you objectively, do you care where he slept?
Not
like, as
remotely.
a serious question.
Not remotely. Like, I genuinely, like, do you care? Like, does it change anything for you if you go to a historic home and they're like, just so you know, George Washington stayed here one night in 1789. We're not sure if he was here with teeth or without.
I mean, it speaks volumes, I think, to me in a bad way, where it says, this is what we care about. We don't care about telling other kinds of stories. And I think it immediately sends a message to a lot of people, like, your history and your family's past probably isn't valued here because we care more about horses that were owned by this person than people that were owned by this person. I looked up the statistics of, sort of plantations in Barbados during her lifetime. And genuinely, like, the rise of a population of enslaved labor was the central event of her grandfather's and would be her and her parents' life. So 1629, the population of the Barbados is 97% white. That changes by 1643, like, it's starting to drop. The population of Black people on the island is 0.03. That jumps to 14%. To be 79% by the 1780s. Wow. So within a century of this book, it goes from 0.03% to 79%. And the Barbados was one of the early places to stop participating in the transatlantic slave trade, not because it was a good thing to do, but because the internal population rate happened to keep increasing on its own. So if she did go back, guaranteed she would have participated in this system and she would have watched this number rise, right? Like, hugely so. 1643 to 1684 goes from 14% to 65%. I mean, that's like genuinely shocking.
Yeah, 100%.
That's a huge number.
It's a huge number. I just kind of wonder, like, I think what it would have cost her if she knew about it. So, like, we don't know. She passed in 1994, I think, or something.
Yes.
We don't know what she knew about slavery in the North in this period. But what would it have cost her to have Kit say aloud, like, this is the job of slaves. Like, why are we picking all these onions? And for Judith or Mercy to say, well, look, we're not like this family who lives over here in town who have 2 enslaved people. Like, we have to do it ourselves. To kind of note that it's there, and that there's like this class difference within their community.
I really think it gets at that question of, like, what she had access to and, like, truly if she would have known. And I think even when you're looking for this information, it's covered so poorly so often, right? Or maybe she felt like she didn't know how to incorporate that information in a way that wouldn't be too shocking, or it would seem too much in passing to do it justice. I don't know. I think that's a hard question.
I truly don't know either. I think something that we both flagged or bumped up against reading this is that the other piece of this book that has not aged well is that she uses the word queer to mean anything but what we understand it to mean today, which, hasn't super aged well.
No, and so one of the main ways that Hannah, who is the Quaker woman who lives alone, she is, the Witch of Blackbird Pond, supposedly, or is she?
Or is she?
That's the whole thing. But she's the Quaker who has to live apart from the community and has to basically pay penalties for the fact that she doesn't attend meeting pre-separation of church and state. This would be like a cool book for people on the Supreme Court to read, but it's like a whole other thing. They might take the wrong lessons from it. But anyway, so she lives apart and she's a Quaker. And that's like a primary word that's used over and over to describe her. And it's sort of this catch-all for her strangeness, like her strangeness in presentation, the way that she doesn't fit in with other people. But basically what she and Kit have in common is they understand how to read other people in their community, but they just can't force themselves to comply. They can't force themselves to be conventional in the way other people want them to. And I think they kind of share a reluctance to just appease men, which is like a kind of reason why they both are really
Iconic.
into Nat.
Yes.
Yeah. Like they're both into Nat. They're not really into Kit's suitor, who seems to be pursuing her because he hopes she still has money. And they both just sort of don't have a lot of interest in the political machinations that they know like are really not their concern, right? Like they really don't involve them because men are not going to give them a space to get involved.
Some of my favorite scenes are when Kit is just trying to make her like pseudo fiance go away. Like when her adopted like family, the parents who are normally very strict, are trying to give her a little bit of freedom or, you know, a moment, some privacy actually to connect with William, who has basically in anything but name her fiance. They have what they call a company room. And Rachel at one point is like, Kit, if you would like to take William into the company room, like you can build up the fire and like basically like canoodle in there. And without it like too much of a pause, she's like, it would take too long to build a fire for that room, any warmth in that room. So
what a metaphor. I think
you should leave. Yeah. Oof. Yeah.
We see right through it. She's like, there's no warmth here.
She's like, there's no fire between us. Bye.
I mean, she's sort of supposed to be with him. Like they catch eyes right away, but you know the whole time that she's interested, and then later she has feelings for Nat, who is someone that she meets in the passage to Weathersfield. But it's someone she really reconnects with because Nat and Hannah are friendly and they have a relationship that is ongoing, and they do end up together. But I also thought it was interesting how these people still knew a lot about each other. Like Nat hears that a wealthy man who is looking to settle down is buying windows. And he's like, wow, it's kind of interesting. Like, you never told me about your engagement. Like, it's the equivalent of people watching each other on Snapchat maps where he's like, wow, kind of interesting. Heard about a shipment of windows. He's like, guess
kind of interesting. I see that you're our friendlies when you told me you were going to stay home tonight. Right. Yeah, I loved that moment because it drops down to such a specific. First of all, I love pettiness. And yes. I love the pettiness that's mapped onto literally like this luxury item that he has to deliver. Yes. And William is like not a character. He's basically like an episode of Property Brothers in the form of a Puritan man. Like it's the only thing that drives him. And it's the only thing of interest. And what's interesting is like Judith is a member of a family that is very frugal. Like they're very modest in a kind of performative religious way. And yet like the thing that drives her is a real desire for status. Yeah. And William is like embodies that in their community because he can afford this house that has windows. And you can kind of like forecast that they're going to be together by the end of the book purely from that. But it doesn't lessen the heartbreak of the scene that never ceases to shock me, which is when Judith decides that she likes John, who is poor but smart. And it's like, look, girl, we all know he wants to be with Mercy. Like, we all know that. And Kit knows that because she caught him on the road and he's like, gonna propose to Mercy tomorrow, like can't wait. And she's like, okay, like I'm very excited for you, forgetting that Judith is obsessed with John. And then he comes over and basically Judith misreads the situation, as Allison points us to. She can't read a room to save her life, and she assumes he's there to ask for like her hand in marriage. No. And just like blows right past him asking the dad for permission. The dad is basically like, take her off my hands, good day. And she's like, okay, great. Thank you. And Mercy there's a moment of heartbreak where it's like, we know because Kit knows. And you look at Mercy and you see the heartbreak on her face, which has made them more, I think, dramatic because we've never heard Mercy say she loves John. So we're all just sort of like pining and like, oh my God, we're 90% sure she's in love with him too. And it's like, I don't know. It was intense for me.
John also goes on this journey of like, he's very much a graduate student. He's like, I'm here to study with the best and the brightest. And then he gets there and he realizes that may not be the case, but he's like, no, it's still going really good.
He's like, it's amazing.
I'm loving every minute of it. And I thought it was very interesting that, you know, Kit remains very unconvinced by their religion and their lifestyle, but that she really vibes with the way that John reads the Bible. And I thought there's something I think very true about that, because I happen to be reading just completely by chance 2 other books right now that are set in the 17th century. And so much about it is the way that people are vibing or not with the way that a minister connects to them emotionally.
100%.
And I'm reading this book called Caleb's Crossing. And it's set almost exactly in the same time period. And this woman's father is a minister, and he's trying to prepare people to go out to be missionaries to indigenous people. And there's so much talk around sort of like, well, what are the qualities that you need? And she seems to be the protagonist of that book, one of the few people that kind of gets that it's about the personal connection. Like, she's making all these personal connections through this friend that she makes among the Wampanoag tribe. And she seems to be the only one that's kind of getting that. And they're trying to teach people English, Greek, and Latin at once. And they're like, it's not going great.
Oh my God.
Like, it's very 17th century. She's like, maybe if you're just like nice,
Pick a lane. I don't know. Well, it also reminds me of grad school too, to like carry on your metaphor that in this period, at least, the ministers had such high expectations of not only their biblical knowledge, but their ability to communicate it and emotionally connect, that it ends up like, if you go read through records, that like basically ministers were year to year. Like, they would be hired and fired with like no questions asked, where they're like, you're blowing it. Yeah, you know the Bible, but you can't connect to anybody. Like, you think you're better than us. And they would just go from place to place and have to really wrangle their paychecks. Like, it was not an easy existence at all.
No, it's very much like adjuncting, where they're both praised as like very important, smart, and valuable people. And people are like, we don't really want to pay for this. Like, we don't want to pay a lot for it. We do want you to work a lot of overtime. We do want you to put in a lot of hours and get a lot of education. We are not interested in paying for it. Thank you so much.
We won't be paying you. There is no housing allotment.
No housing.
Like, I don't know where you're, like, maybe there's a barn you can crash in. Like, I don't know. Figure it out. But we're rooting for you. And also, but then it's like 2 weeks later, they're like, your privilege and your ego are offending the entire community. Like, please put a pin in it.
I thought Rachel's husband in that same way was a very interesting character, because right away Kit does not connect with him. She finds him insufferable because he is, and she doesn't get what Rachel, who she had only really known of as this great beauty, saw in this guy. She's like, he's a 6. He's very cranky. I don't understand. And she learns that there's deaths that have led to kind of him feeling dimmed. And then the whole perception of him kind of turns around when he gets really fired up. Page 71, he kind of goes off about like his rights and what he deserves. And he says, justice, what do young men know about rights and justice? A soft life is all you've ever known. Have you felled the trees in a wilderness and built a home with your bare hands? Have you fought off the wolves and the Indians? Have you frozen and starved through a single winter? The men who made this town understood justice.
Intense.
Well, I feel like it's also this narrative that is based on kind of like as if people came to a land that had nothing.
Exactly.
And he's like, you don't understand. We started at -25. And that whole kind of discourse of like, is this the first town? Is this the first anything? It's like, well, actually, like there was people here, but you ignored it and acted like you were starting at a deficit or at 0.
Yeah, my first natural response to that was like, okay, boomer, because like that rhetoric of like nobody helped me is very of like the worst of what people say about like boomer responses. But, you know, it's kind of like this I was born in a log cabin, I built myself attitude, which we actually also associate with early America. So like actually a later period as well. But this fantasy of coming to an empty wilderness, I do think is also an issue with this book, because yes, like she knows enough to put that in his mouth as like something that's meant to be read, I think in a kind of absurd way. So I think she has this awareness. But I think her peers did not. And in even like thinking about how people wrote about nature as natural and the wilderness as empty when white people arrived is so insane, but also like not something that was challenged until relatively recently. And I think it's also worth saying that, you know, we haven't really talked about like the history of witchcraft in Connecticut. But one of the things that's really interesting, and we'll post links to this, is a lot of the records are actually have been digitized. So you can actually go check them out. But the accusations, if you look at the pool of people who were accused, include indigenous people. So it's interesting to me, too, like, did she not know that that was amongst, she's focusing on Wethersfield where that didn't happen, but she shows an awareness of, like, the rest of the state or the colony at this point having folks accused. But I think it changes things, too, to be like, this isn't just something that affects mostly white women and a few men. It's also affecting like indigenous men and women as well. And it becomes a mark of strangeness, which Elizabeth George would call queer, which we're not calling queer, but in a way that like is interesting too.
Yeah, and to that same end, I found an article that was really good, really comprehensive about Wethersfield and that onion piece again. But there's a line in the article which says, nobody in Wethersfield ever asked where they went. And I don't know about that. I think people knew. And I say that because really sharp research has been done in places like Little Compton, Rhode Island, where people historically have never connected that community to the slave trade. It's always been Bristol, Rhode Island, or bigger places like Newport and Boston. And part of the granular research was showing that one of the most common investments that like what we would call middling people were making was in slave ships. So they were buying into slave ships as an investment. And I have a hard time believing that people who are picking, right, what they're calling 100,000 ropes of onions, like a truly unbelievable amount, are then confused when in the 1830s, those orders start dropping off in part because of like the final collapse of the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
Like I think also at the same time, and I think it's a little bit too simple to say this, you have to look at the labels in your own clothes at some point and say, I know.
Right.
Right? Like, I mean, you can only be told so many times and say you don't know.
Well, that's what I was going to say is like, if you actually look at newspapers, it literally equates them in front of your face. So if you're looking at, there are a lot of cases of Wethersfield merchants who report runaway slaves in newspapers with very clear descriptions of their physicality, what they were wearing the day that they left, et cetera, et cetera. And they appear literally in the next column from the very goods that they're selling. So if you can't connect those dots, like on a certain level, we can't help you. But it's kind of like, it's not hiding in plain sight, because again, we don't want to engage in that language about stuff that's hidden, because the whole point is that it wasn't hidden. It was so transparent. Yeah. You have to do that intellectual labor, and it's a choice to delude yourself and say, this isn't property, it's people, and all of these different things where it's like you're equating people as property in the columns of your newspapers with the same goods that you sell. You're making that choice. But at the same time, these same folks, it's reported in the paper, are going with their enslaved people to the Congregational Church in Old Wethersfield and sponsoring them as they declare their faith and enter the church. So it like there's all of these ways that their lives are absolutely intertwined. So to not present them as such and to have this absence, not really in this book, I don't think that's like the issue with the time period, but reading books set in the Revolutionary period for sure, it's like, how can you consciously do that?
Well, this book also got me thinking about what was happening in 1958, and there's a really good preface in my book by Karen Cushman, and it talks about how like there's this culture, right, of repression and this culture of surveillance, right, and what we would think of as HUAC and other things. But an event that happened in 1958, not long or around the time that this book came out, was the bombing of the Bethel Baptist Church in Alabama by the Klan. And there's actually several like very big events that happen with intense violence between the Klan and people. And like particularly out west, which I didn't really know about, but I was thinking like the actual witch hunt that's happening is, there are civil rights organizations that have more FBI members than regular members. Like that's the actual witch hunt by this time, is federal government infiltrating, spying on all of these people. I think it's like people have had a lot of conversations about, the way that the government persecuted certain dissidents, but I think the full scope of their attempts to take down particularly Black radicals, like this is the exact time where that's happening also. Like that's a real witch hunt.
And I actually think her choice of how she describes or sets up the actual witch test is really interesting, because I think it relates to this events that you're describing that are contemporaneous with the book, which is, so basically the Quaker woman Hannah gets accused of being a witch for reasons that are as insane as you can imagine. This is like where the foreignness of the past jumps out, where it's like she turned into a mouse and passed her witch powers to Kit in that bodily transformation. And there's all these like sort of natural world occurrences that people cite in their accusation of Hannah. And so Hannah gets smuggled out by Kit with Nat on the Dolphin, so she doesn't have to actually stand trial. But Kit then is accused, and in her trial, the thing that they show her, the horn book that they find in Hannah's house, and a book in which a young girl named Prudence, who she has taught to read and to write her name has written her name. And basically they say, like, here, you wrote this child's name, you were casting a spell on her. And it's in keeping with these other accusations that are like, Kit touched my child and he took to bed for 5 days, like he was sick, whatever. But then Nat brings Prudence in, and Prudence has to prove in front of everyone that she wrote her own name and that she can read. And she has to prove she can read by reading the Bible aloud. And it's just really fascinating because that's not often the witch test that was actually used in Connecticut. It was a water test more than anything else. In other words, we throw you in some water. If you drown, it means you're not a witch. But if you float, it means you are a witch. So you can imagine like how this went for most people. But like to use a literacy test in 1958 as an embodiment of witch trials, I was like, whoa, like Elizabeth Speare, like you were operating on a deeper level than even I realized, truly.
Well, to think of like a water test in relation to civil rights, like we've talked before about like the disparities when we were studying Samantha between Black, white, and other communities with regards to drowning. And like part of why the test wouldn't have proved anything with Kit is because we learned in like the first 5 pages that she can swim.
Yes.
And she's basically coached by folks on the ship, like, oh, just so you know, like if you're ever in a witch test, like this is what being a witch means or doesn't mean. It's pretty shocking.
It's scary.
I wanted to bring up a book that I think listeners would appreciate. I think it's pretty accessible. We've both read it, called New York Burning. Mm-hmm. And it's about the witch hunt that you've probably never heard of, which is a series of people who were burned in New York City in 1741 in the wake of what people thought was a revolt, particularly among enslaved people. And 161 Black people and 20 white people were arrested as part of this. More than a dozen people were actually hanged, like many people were convicted, and they burned 13 Black people at the stake. They banished 70 more, and many people were deported. And as with like other instances, often people were deported to Barbados or to other parts of the Caribbean, which was considered a death sentence in part because people lacked immunity. And so people wouldn't have used that language, but people understood that. In Massachusetts during King Philip's War, there were people who were deported to the West Indies, and part of what was understood about that was that they would probably die as a result of that deportation. So they would be sold for money and then die as a result of immunity. And that book is by Jill Lepore, and she talks about, like, why have you never heard of this? And why do you only know about Salem or, other communities where witch hunts happened when this is like very much worse and just really never talked about?
I think that your flagging of like the movement, like the connotation with the West Indies and disease and death is really interesting, because when I was reading this and she gets identified as a witch, it's actually interesting because like accusations of witchcraft, as many people have written about, often stem from people trying to assign blame for natural occurrences like poor crops, disease outbreaks, whatever, in communities. And finding some kind of cause that they can rectify through, trial and whatnot. So, but what's interesting is, so like, she gets accused of being a witch. She's basically immediately like, I am not a witch. However, she actually on some level could be the thing that they're accusing her of. Mm-hmm. Like, as someone who has traveled from the West Indies, she could have been an asymptomatic carrier of all kinds of things to their community as an outsider. So in an interesting way, like from a medical history perspective, I don't know if witch is the right word, but like there is a way that like disease and storytelling come together to kind of make sense of disparate elements in a world kind of cohabitating or coming together in ways that otherwise don't make sense.
Yeah. And I think after what we've lived through in 2020, I think any judgment we might have had of the way that people handled disease in other periods, people need to really, pump the brakes. We've had folks reach out to us who are listening to our Kirsten episodes where we talk a lot about disease transmission because of the death of her friend Marta. And a few people have said, it's almost too much because listening to it is very uncanny and strange, because we recorded those episodes pre-pandemic, but talked about historical pandemics. And now it's very odd to listen to us talking about it and kind of like the ways that disease has been mismanaged in the past. And it was an unfortunate foreshadowing that we obviously didn't plan. Like, we didn't know what was going to happen.
Tragically, yeah. I do want to just share something that's interesting about this book with shows that she has done her homework, which is that she has set it after 1662. So the first Connecticut witch accusations that we know about date to 1647, when Alice Young of Windsor, Connecticut was accused and actually hanged. But this book takes place after 1662, which matters only insofar as John Winthrop Jr. returns to Connecticut after around 1662. So there's been all of these trials. Multiple people from Wethersfield are accused and executed. He comes back and he has a lot of skepticism about the structure of the trials, which actually you could only have one person accuse someone of being a witch and say, like, yeah, I saw Allison turn into a cat. She's a witch, like, obviously. And my word would be enough to warrant a conviction. But he comes along and basically says, because he has skepticism of the structure, you need to have more than one witness confirm or report a single incident. So you can't just have one person come on and say, like, Allison turned into a cat in front of me. Like, you have to have two people come and say, I witnessed Allison turn into a cat, independent of one another. So it's interesting that she set the book. So that was in 1662, that became a requirement of conviction. And so it's interesting that she picked that, because then you see in the trial that actually it's the uncle who reminds everyone, you can't just have one person accuse someone. Like, there's laws. And then basically he's like, but why are we even talking about laws? Like, this is insane.
Yeah. Like, if you think we've moved past this, so I, call it whatever you will call it. We watched Hubie's Halloween this week, which I regret. It's the new Adam Sandler vehicle on Netflix.
Oh, wow.
And there's a bizarre lycanthropy angle. And I was watching this thinking, I don't know that intellectually we are that far apart from the events that transpire in this book. But I won't speak more on that film. It's unkind. I did want to tell you, I did want to tell you a shocking thing I learned, which is something was in the water the year this book came out. And I want you to quick respond to what I learned. There was both tremendously important and tragic civil rights events and other bizarre events, such as the official operation of NASA, which we won't go into further. But I mentioned there was extreme violence committed by members of the Ku Klux Klan. So I'm looking at other events and I'm thinking, what else is going on? Because Karen Cushman writes about this in her introduction, because the 50s was her childhood. Listen to the people who were born, and things, I should say, in 1958. Okay. Pizza Hut. Mm-hmm. Betsy DeVos.
Wow.
The Hula Hoop.
Wow.
Ellen DeGeneres.
Who?
And then, true, Ice-T, Prince, Madonna, and Michael Jackson. So, like, seriously, what was going on? And to think that all of these people are babies screaming, crying somewhere, and she's winning the Newbery medal. What a year. What a bizarre time.
I'm sorry. Like, Pizza Hut and Prince. But then you got Betsy DeVos in there, and it's like, ugh.
I think I find putting all of that kind of information together helpful, because I think people have either been taught history as trivia or history as big events, and it's obviously all of those things. And I think the way that people have been taught information about other years in history has not equipped them well to deal with years like 2020, where it's like, it's always all of these things, right?
Right.
It's a Black Lives Matter uprising at the same time that TikTok gains dominance of our brains. Like, these things always, they happen in clusters.
Brain. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too that, like, looking through, and we'll post the links to this, there is some documentation about this history in Connecticut if you're interested. Like, I guess I'm curious, like, why this isn't a bigger deal. Like, both the commemoration of Connecticut's witchcraft history, which way predates Salem, and also, like, why this book isn't a bigger deal. And I just to further emphasize the mastery or, like, the research of Elizabeth Speare. And I'll post a picture of this because I went and walked around Old Wethersfield this past weekend, where they have a scarecrow competition every year. And some of them are genuinely very good this year about like distance learning and all kinds of stuff. But somebody simply just put up a grave to Catherine Harris. Catherine Harris was one of the last women accused of witchcraft in Wethersfield. And basically she was accused because her husband left her a giant estate and people were haters and were like, using her lands to graze animals. And she fought back against this. And they basically were like, she was a massive gossip, therefore she's a witch, and like invented all these things. But the solution for her was that she left like voluntarily. In the course of multiple accusations, she got remarried and she moved to New York State somewhere. But I think that's really interesting because it's like Elizabeth George took this real woman's history, who was clearly like older in terms of life cycle, and like kind of for whatever reason did away with like the probate angle and instead made it like a young girl who's just an outsider.
I think part of why that story doesn't resonate as much as, say, like a Salem is Salem like allows people to like confirm certain things that they already believe. Like teenage girls are hysterical. They create problems. People who are overly dogmatic are willing to go to extremes to solve community problems. And I think like if you isolate it to one place, the overall story that you can tell about New England is very different than understanding that it was a symptom of many of these colonies and the way that they were run. I also think, like we've talked about before, partially because of the muddiness of the world that we live in, like the importance of the distinction of separating church and state is like very much been lost over time.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's true.
It's majorly true. Like the importance of that to me is absolutely vital. But I think even in this moment, like it's not that many years prior to this book coming out that Under God, it like, and In God We Trust comes into like printed money and the Pledge of Allegiance being said in school every day. So even as she's writing this book, which to me is like this really baller move, like emphasizing the importance of that division, she's writing it in a moment when it's being muddied in her lifetime too. And she's writing a book about witchcraft that instead of presenting girls as hysterical accusers, instead makes the adults the hysterical accusers and the children are the ones who have the wisdom. So this book is like transgressive in really unexpected ways.
Yeah, I mean, I was very pleasantly surprised giving it my reread. And after the error of my ways with our last Dear America, I have atoned with this book.
We still remember.
Yes. I do just want to recommend a book that I think people might like that I got a lot out of a few years ago. It's called The Manor by Matt Griswold. And it's about the Sylvester Manor, which is located on Long Island. And it's a community that has these very long connections with the Barbados as well as localized slavery. And it does a really compact job of taking hundreds of years of history attached to one property and global trade and making it understandable. And it doesn't, as far as I remember, it doesn't start from that place of like, you're never going to believe that this happened here. It's like, these were the connections between these places. And this is how people maintained wealth, across an empire, which is what it was.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, totally. I also think we can recommend a place that you and I have been together, which is the house that this was imagined, like that sort of inspired Elizabeth George Speare to do this, I guess.
Yes.
Which is now a house museum, part of a group of house museums in Wethersfield owned by the Colonial Dames. And what's really interesting about this place is that it was in private hands till the 1940s, and then it was converted and like kind of taken back to its original time period and filled with furniture that a particular dame bought. So it's both a house museum of a place and time, but it's also sort of like one woman's fantasy of what the 17th century looked like.
It was a different time.
It was a different time, but it's like
the 40s. I mean,
the 40s were a different time. But that's my dream, is like, give me like one person's weird, twisted fantasy of the past, like in the form of a house museum, and I will sign up every time.
I mean, controversial. That's what they all are, whether you
Right.
choose to recognize it or not, right? There's like a meta narrative that flows through the boarding house that I work in when it's non-COVID times. And you have to say it to people because otherwise it won't be clear. Like, this is this interpretation of this, and here's another interpretation. I think subtlety isn't actually useful in house museums.
No, definitely not.
Speaking of lacking subtlety, do we dare make November listener's choice?
I think we should. I think you and I have had a couple months to kind of work out some initial things that were passion projects for us, you might say. And now I think we should turn it over to the listeners. So, please contact us with what you think November should be about. It could be a book. It could be a movie. It could be, I don't know. We're open-minded.
I'm very open. I've gotten to read a few things that I really, really loved. And having Karen Cushman back in my life was very exciting because I loved her books, even just in the form of a prologue. So I'm open to anything.
So maybe we'll have you guys contact us. You can email us at americangirlspod@gmail.com. Allison can fill us in with the rest of the socials in case I get them wrong.
Yeah, so you can feel free to message us on Patreon. And I think what we'll probably do is we'll wait till people send in some preliminary stuff, and then we'll set up a poll like we do with movie nights and other things. And so you can reach out to us, find everything on americangirlspod.com. You can email us at americangirlspod@gmail.com. And we are American Girls Podcast on Instagram. And you can find us on Twitter at @girlspod.
Now, Allison, if people want to accuse you of being a witch, where would they bring those accusations?
At Mimi Mahoney. No, I'm kidding. So at Allison Horrocks, we can follow me on Instagram or Twitter. And Mary, if people want to learn more about Wethersfield's history, we did have an inquiry already about, I was going to call them straw men. What are they called? The people that get put outside.
Scarecrows?
Scarecrows. If people...
Yep. If people want to know. I actually took pictures of a suffrage scarecrow that I would love to post in honor of Allison Lang, our friend. I say our friend. I've been let into the group text. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Life-changing. And I also took one of the Catherine Harris tombstone, R.I.P., thinking about you, girl. But if you want to accuse me of being a witch, look, I welcome it. Write to me on Instagram at Mimi Mahoney or Twitter at Mary Mahoney123. And someday look forward to my future book called Ways You Should Have Known You're Probably on Some Spectrum of Queer, Identifying as a Witch and or Stevie Nicks, a life story. Thank you.